Hello and welcome to the second lesson on the cardiovascular system, where I will be discussing blood. As we know, the purpose of the circulatory system is to move blood around the body as a carrier for oxygen and nutrients. So in this lesson, I really want to get more into what blood is, what its purposes are. The components of blood are plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And plasma makes up 55% of your blood. The white blood cells and platelets make up less than 1%, and the white blood cells, which are also called erythrocytes, make up 45% of the blood. Plasma is roughly 90% water, and it contains plasma proteins such as antibodies and fibrinogen, which we'll get into in a second. It also carries lipids, glucose, electrolytes, hormones, and dissolved gases. So when people talk about blood sugar, the sugar is dissolved into the plasma. And these electrolytes are dissolved mineral ions. And so when a sports drink says it has electrolytes, it is trying to replenish the electrolytes in your plasma. However, usually if you just eat some food that replenishes your electrolytes enough, and then you don't have all that added sugar of the sports drink. The red blood cells make up 45% of your blood, and they are responsible for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. This is by using the hemoglobin that is in the red blood cell, which contains heme. Heme is the molecule inside the hemoglobin that carries the oxygen and carbon dioxide, and it does this by slightly binding the oxygen or carbon dioxide to the iron center in heme. And that iron center in heme is what gives blood the red color for mammals. And red blood cells are produced in bone marrow. Not all animals have red blood. Some have blue, green, or violet are also options. But I wanted to focus on blue because I think it's the coolest. So spiders, crustaceans, squid, and octopi have blue blood. And this is because their protein in their blood, rather than having iron like ours does, they have copper. And so if you've ever seen copper in the lab, it has a pretty blue color in a certain state. And animals that have this certain type of blood have hemocyanin instead of hemoglobin. And that makes sense because cyan is a different way to say blue, so it's basically saying blue blood. White blood cells are another component of blood, and two main types of white blood cells are lymphocytes and phagocytes. Lymphocytes produce antibodies. And as we saw in the virus lesson, the antibodies attach to antigens to mark them for consumption. Then the phagocytes come up and eat the pathogen. So what happens is the cell envelops around the pathogen and then encases it and then eventually digests it. Another component of blood is platelets, and the point of platelets is to aid in clotting. Platelets bind to a ruptured blood vessel, and then the fibrin, which is made by fibrinogen, which is in the plasma, one of those plasma proteins, and the fibrin stretches across the broken portion of a blood vessel and pulls it back together. Red blood cells have glycoproteins on the outside of the cell. When this was taught to me, my teacher compared red blood cells to frosted flakes because they are both have a sugar coating, and so glycoproteins are kind of like sugars. There are two types of glycoproteins, A and B. And whatever mixture of A and B you have determines your blood type. In type A, you have only type A glycoproteins. With type B, you have type B. Then there's AB, which you have both A and B glycoproteins. Or type O, which means that you have neither type of glycoprotein. When we have blood transfusions, it's important to match blood types because our blood reads these different glycoproteins as antigens. And so if we have a new type of blood, our immune system will think that these new red blood cells are invaders and want to destroy them. So in order for our blood to stay happy, we have to make sure that our blood type matches. And so again, with transfusions, people with AB type blood have the antigens and antibodies for both A and B glycoproteins. So they can have either A or B type blood and without any issue. People with type O are considered universal donors, and this is because they don't have those glycoproteins on them, so their red blood cells will not be tagged as a pathogen for people with either A, B, or AB type blood. There are different blood disorders that can occur. One that's pretty common is sickle cell anemia, which is a genetic disorder, and the blood vessels have a different shape, and this makes them slightly less effective at carrying oxygen than the donut-shaped red blood vessels. However, people who have sickle cell anemia are slightly more they're slightly more protected against malaria, and so in certain populations where malaria is more prevalent, sickle cell anemia is a bit higher because this is genetically favorable, and so the occurrence in the population has increased. There's also hemophilia, and that is a disorder where the clotting process is slow, which leads to excessive bleeding if injured. This diagram that is on the right is somewhat misleading. It's a cross-section of a blood vessel. It kind of looks like a red blood vessel, or like a red blood cell, but it's a vein or an artery or a capillary. And so in people who have hemophilia, either their platelets aren't functioning properly or their fibrin aren't closing the blood vessel enough. And so what's most dangerous about hemophilia is the increased risk of internal bleeding. Here we see a diagram of the different amounts of the components of blood that can occur in different blood disorders or just different conditions. So normally we see that the red blood cell count is 45% of the volume of blood, but if in people who have anemia, they have a low red blood cell count, and so in this they would have about 30%. And so the rest of that volume is made up by plasma. There's another blood disorder called polycythemia, which is too high of a red blood cell count, and so one of the symptoms of that is fatigue, and but that is much less common than anemia. There's also, if you're dehydrated, you're going to have less plasma, and so by volume you would end up having more erythrocytes or red blood cells. And so that's another reason why it is super important to stay hydrated, is so that our blood can keep flowing and be at the right mixture for us to be healthy. That's all I have on blood. So answer the questions that are associated with this lesson and submit that by April 24th. If you have any questions, email me or attend a Zoom meeting.